Every week, we try to bring you the very best thought leaders in leadership. Today, I bring you a thought leader and a resoundingly successful leader for a long period of time. Wisdom and ideas from past history and great thinking for the future. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by 13 Days to Remarkable Leadership, a free leadership video series based on Kevin's book, Remarkable Leadership. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/13 days. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
It's another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You're going to be glad that you are here. It's always my goal that each week you're glad that you are here. And I know that that will be the case today. Our guest today is Bill Novelli. He has had a distinguished career as a leader in both corporate and nonprofit worlds. He was the CEO of, get this, AARP, the founder and president of Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, an executive vice president of CARE, and the president and co-founder of Porter Novelli, the global public relations agency. He started his career in brand management, working on brands that you know and recognize. Today, he is a professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, where he teaches in the MBA program, and also founded and oversees the Georgetown Business for Impact initiative. He is the co-chair of the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care, a national alliance to reform advanced illness end-of-life care in the U.S., and serves on a number of boards and committees. He's the author of several books, including the new book, Good Business, The Talk, Fight, Win Way to Change the World. And he holds BA and MAs from the University of Pennsylvania, even though he's now at Georgetown. Bill, welcome. I'm glad that you're here, sir.
Oh, Kevin, I'm glad to be here too. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to have you. So this new book in many ways is a biography. So I don't want you to tell us everything because people are going to want to go get the book, but I would like you to say a little bit about your journey, like sort of how you ended up with that very distinguished career. Just give us a sort of the high, like what were a couple of spots or times that led you through this path, if you would?
Well, the first thing I can tell you is that it wasn't linear. It was not a straight line, that's for sure. As you said, I started it at Unilever, and I was a brand manager. And back in those days, Kevin, you know, Madison Avenue was pretty hot. It was kind of like Wall Street is today. And in those days, you were supposed to work both sides of the street to make it in the world of marketing and advertising. So I went to a hot New York advertising agency. And I worked on a variety of brands there. And, you know, it was no heavy lifting. I was making money, raising a young family. But my problem was that I wasn't finding any social relevance in my work. And I'd go home at night and say, I've got to work on this. And then one day, the agency gave me a new account. And it was public television. It was the first time I think they'd hired an agency to build audience. And the first thing I did was to go to a press conference run by a woman named Joan Gantz Cooney. And she was saying, I'm going to tell you today how we're going to revolutionize children's television. And of course, she was talking about Sesame Street.
Right.
Yeah. And a light bulb kind of went off. And I thought to myself, you know, this woman is an educator for sure, but she's a marketing person. And I think that I could take the same marketing skills that I use to sell packaged goods and apply them to issues and ideas and concepts and causes like she is. And so that was like an epiphany for me. And so I thought to myself, can I make a career out of this? And the short answer is I did.
From cereal to social causes. How about that? It's not quite alliteration, but it's close, Bill.
Yeah.
It sounds like alliteration. So, early, and you tell that story in the book, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's a perfect way to give people the full picture, like where you started and where you ended up. So you talk in the book about us finding our own purpose, and now you're at Georgetown, so you're working with students a lot as well. But what would you say to anyone who's with us today about finding their own purpose? Lots has been written about it, but what's your take here? What would you share with folks?
The first thing I would say is that I believe that we can find our own purpose. And my thesis, Kevin, is that wherever you are, whatever organization you work in, whatever sector you're in, whatever stage you're at, you can make a dent in the universe. You can make a positive social difference. And I see this all the time. And I have these student alumni who come back to me and talk about how they're doing it. I talk to retirees. I think that really it's an opportunity for all of us, and it's getting to be better and better. And the reason I think it is, Kevin, is that more and more companies are figuring this out. And what I think companies are learning is that they can create more financial value for their stockholders by creating environmental and social value for the rest of society. And they know that young people want this. They know that young people want purpose as well as a paycheck. And the result of all this is momentum that we can all take advantage of.
Yeah, I love that. In the book, you talk about purpose and profit. I love that you now say purpose and a paycheck for us individually, as well as profit for the organization.
Oh, absolutely. I'm all for profit.
You and me both. You made early in the book, you make it so like, I am a capitalist. I'm like, hoorah, me too. Is it perfect? No, but we're human. Nothing.
That's right. That's right.
So I just want to highlight something for everyone who's listening. And that is that, that idea that all of us can make a difference, can make a dent in the universe, to use Bill's words. That in some ways is why this podcast exists, because we've got people that listen. Every one of you that's listening is just you, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm listening. But we've got CEOs, and we've got mid-level leaders, and we've got entrepreneurs, and we've got front-level leaders, and we've got aspiring leaders, and we got all sorts of people around the world who are listening and or watching. And I think it's really important that you hear what Bill said, because he and I share that belief that wherever we are, we can make that difference. And figuring out that purpose is such an important part of our future. How about sharing an example or two of organizations, maybe a current favorite example of organizations that have sort of figured this out, that we can do good and still we can be good and do good, right? Be successful as well. Any current examples you want to share?
Well, I'll share two, Kevin. The first one is CVS Health. So, I worked a long time on tobacco control. And so I have a particular interest in CVS Health. They started out by saying, we want to be a health company. So why are we selling cigarettes? And they made this courageous move. They removed tobacco products from their stores. And it cost them about $2 billion a year in revenues.
That's with a B, everybody.
With a B. And
that's a lot of cigarettes, just saying.
Exactly. But that was only the beginning for them. So they removed tobacco. They transformed themselves, repositioned themselves into a health company. They've made all kinds of changes. And so what they basically did was to say to themselves, we can create profit. We can create stockholder value, but we can really create social value at the same time. And that is their sweet spot. That's how they found it.
Perfect. It's a great example.
Another favorite is the VF Corporation. So I work with them, and I like to say this is the biggest company nobody ever heard of. VF has all these iconic brands like Timberland and Vans and the North Face. And so VF handles the supply chain and the manufacturing, and then the brands market themselves. So they have about 1 million workers around the world in Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Africa, Central America. But these workers are working in contract factories. They're not direct employees of VF.
Right.
But VF says, we're going to treat and most of them are women. We're going to treat these women like they're like our own. And they do this for two basic reasons, as I understand it. Reason number one is because they want these women to be as productive as possible, and because they think it's the right thing to do. So they go out and they do all this survey research, and they find out what these women want. And maybe they want childcare, clean water, eyeglasses, some protection from sexual harassment on the job. But the second reason they do it is because they know that millennials, prime customers of VF stores and VF brands, they don't just want to know what the price is or what the fit is or what the fashion is. They want to know, are the people making these products being treated fairly? So there you have another sweet spot.
Perfect. So we've got two companies with letters, right? CVS
That's
and
right.
VF. So awesome. So the book, the subtitle of the book is interesting, and it's a theme of the book, which is often the case for a subtitle of a book. It says the talk, fight, win way to change the world. So what is the talk, fight, win way, Bill?
Well, it's a lesson I learned early on, and I've applied for my whole career. So here's what it's
It sounds like a cheerleader somehow.
Yeah.
Like every time I read it, I keep thinking like cheerleaders when I was in high school, but they did a lot of talking, but they didn't say that in the cheer.
Yeah, and cheerleaders don't usually fight.
That's true, but they want the team to, right? At least that's the way they used to
fight.
When you and I were in school, that was, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So here's what I mean. Today's issues, if you look at the issues we face today, the social issues, the environmental issues, these things are enormous. They're way too big for endless combat. So my theory is that you got to get everybody at the table. And when you do that, you're not going to agree. And Tuesday's opponent might be Thursday's ally. And so the way I think of it is there are no permanent opponents. There's only permanent values and permanent principles. And sure, we're going to talk, and sure, we're going to fight. But if we do that, eventually we win. And I've fought some good fights and talked some good fights with all different kinds of sectors and industries. And for the most part, the customer, the public, the constituents are the winners.
That's awesome. I think it's from a person who knows a little bit about the world of publishing, having written a bunch of books. I love that as a subtitle, but I love the idea that you just shared. So thanks for that. I told you before we started that I would sort of say, hey, we're going to talk about the book some, and then I just want to talk to you some. I got one more question from the book. I believe it's the title of the last chapter, and it is about our grandchildren. And I think that the chapter is even the question. What do we owe our grandchildren? So I'm going to ask you that question. What do we owe our grandchildren?
Well, I wrote 8 chapters of the book, and then I put it down. And I thought about that last chapter. I have grandchildren, and the title was a way of saying, what do we owe future generations? And the way I see it, Kevin, is that we were given a great country. Yes, we have our flaws, we have our problems, we have our issues, but America is a great country. And all 4 of my grandparents came here from somewhere else. And as I was growing up and as I became an adult, I thought, what are those immigrant values that we need to pass on, that we need to think about? And as I thought about it, it was love of country. We love America. Secondly, strength of family. A reverence for education, and an appetite for hard work. So how do we pass that on to our children and our grandchildren who have so much? And I think that the American dream is strong, but it's flawed. It's a bit tattered, and we've got to deal with it. And we got to deal with everything from this toxic political mess we have to climate change, to look at infrastructure, the snows that we're facing right now, everything. We've got to deal with these things, and we're capable of doing it. And America traditionally has had its problems, but they tend to be cyclical. And what we need more than anything else today is leadership. So we've got to fix these problems. We've got to lead, and it's our legacy to pass on a better country.
As you say that, and I love that, love of country, strength of family, value of education, and appetite for hard work. I've never heard that phrase. I promise that I will use it, and I promise I will credit you. That's a great list. But as I listen to you, what you just said, Bill, here's what struck me is because I'm right with you that while we've always had problems, it is cyclical, right? And if you think about the level of patriotism, for example, after 9/11 and versus what we might consider the level of patriotism now, it's cyclical. I'm just using that as a simple example. And then you finished that by saying, and that's why we need leaders. And as leaders, we have to look further out, right? We have to think beyond the month, the quarter, or the year to where we're really trying to go. What's our destination? And I think that that's the call that I hear in what you just said, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And the great joy of my life is that I get to see those leaders of tomorrow in the classrooms of today.
At Georgetown, I have been I probably walked in some of the same buildings as you, all didn't go to school there. As a Big Ten guy, I looked out at the football stadium, which is sort of right in the middle of the campus. I thought, well, this is quaint.
Yeah. Well,
it's actually very cool. It's actually very cool. So I want to transition and ask you a few things. Bill, when we started this podcast, I said I want to have on leadership experts and expert leaders, and you fit in both of those categories. Certainly, you've written a number of books. You've got a lot of things to say, but you've had a long career, and you can look back on that now in a number of ways. And so I've just got 3 or 4 questions, if you'll indulge me, that I'd like to ask you that I think if anyone who was listening was in my seat might ask. So, these are not the questions you're likely going to get asked by anyone else when you're on this, when you're promoting this book. But I hope you'll indulge me as I ask a few. So I guess I'd just like to leverage your experience, if we can. I want you to think back to when you were first a leader. I mean, you went to work at Unilever and you were a salesperson, you had the station wagon, you tell that story in the book, but at some point you became a leader. And I'd like you to think back to when you were first a leader, when you made the transition to being a leader, and having done that at least once, what advice would you have for new leaders today?
Well, I tell my students, and I teach ethical leadership, and I say to them, I'm not going to make you into a leader. When you leave this classroom, you're not going to be a great leader. What I hope to teach you, though, is how to learn to be a leader. And it's going to take you a career to do it. And that's got to be what you focus on. And, I don't know that I ever woke up one day and said, wow, I made it. I'm a leader. I think it's evolutionary, Kevin. But I can think of a couple times when, I stood up and I showed some moxie and I showed some courage and I led. And I remember one time I was dealing with the former Prime Minister of Australia, a guy named Malcolm Fraser. He was a tough guy, a very tough guy. But if you confronted him, he would back down and he would give what I used to call his sin speech. We're just a small island nation. And this was about international development. And I basically had the courage of my convictions, and I had the reasoning, I had the information, I had done my homework, and I stood up to Malcolm Fraser, and I said, "Mr. Prime Minister, you're wrong, and here's why I think so." And we didn't fight; we basically agreed. And it was after that that I thought to myself, you can come to a meeting of the minds with almost anybody, and if you can't, you've done your best.
Awesome. It's interesting. I'm reflecting on everything that you're saying and thinking back to lots of past guests and a variety of other things. And it's interesting because when I asked you the question, I was thinking about moving into a position of being the leader or the manager. But you were talking about the practice of leading. And I talk about both of those a lot, and that leadership at the end of the day isn't about a position or a role, but is about the action that we take. And I really appreciate that. So the reason I stopped you there, though, is for everyone that's listening, don't get lost in the, well, I'll never have a conversation with the former Prime Minister of Australia. Right? The lesson that Bill just shared with you, that's a cool story, right? That makes it an interesting story. But your story doesn't have to be about that, and likely won't be about that, right? Anything you want to add to that point of that, Bill?
Yeah, I really do. I learned a lesson from Colin Powell, and it's something that you said a few minutes ago. You don't have to be the CEO. You don't have to be the president to be a leader. What Colin Powell said was, and I believe this firmly, is that you can lead from the middle of the ranks. You can lead from the middle. You can be in the ranks, and you can show the kind of leadership that people need. So many of us lead teams. Team leadership is an important part of organizational leadership.
So it's interesting. It's almost like you're reading my notes, which of course you're not, because the next question I had for you was about teams. So talk to me about what are a couple of key things you've learned about building teams, leading teams in your career?
I'm a big believer in teams. Absolutely. And here's what I've learned. I remember one day I was sitting in my office at the end of the day at AARP. And I said to myself, about 100 decisions a day are made in this organization. It's a big organization that influence the future of AARP. And I'm sitting here making maybe 5 of them. So who's making those other 95 decisions? And the answer is the teams below me. And it cascades down throughout an organization, whether it's a big company, whatever it may be. And so teams are critically important. And what I've learned is that you've got to nurture teams, you've got to support them, you've got to check your ego at the door, because you need to give teams the opportunity to tell you what's wrong with your ideas. And then the other thing about teams, Kevin, is that you've got to have some courage, because when teams have people on board who are not rowing in the same direction, you've got to remove them. It's easy to build teams. It's easy to hire people. It's not so much fun to take people off. But I like to say, and I like to believe that mediocrity is like a chronic disease. I mean, you can live with it for a long time, but eventually it's going to do you in.
Hey, everybody, that line right there. And Lisa, there's a good quote for us for social media. But that right there, everybody, is worth the price of admission. Of course, your price was 0. Mediocrity is like a chronic illness.
Yep.
That's worth us all thinking about. I think it's right. You're not going to die, but it's painful every day.
And eventually you may die.
And eventually, eventually we all are going to die. But it's much sooner than you might have had to have, right?
That's right.
Absolutely. So, it's interesting because you led AARP, and so through all that work, you've thought a lot about, and you've written about this idea of the opportunities of older workers. So many people want to talk about managing millennials, especially people that look like you and I want to talk about managing millennials because they seem different than us. And quite honestly, they're a bigger and bigger part of the workforce. But I'm not really interested in talking about that today. I'd like to talk to you about managing or leading older workers. Like, do you have a couple of pieces of advice for us about doing that? I'm actually in the process. We're actually in a hiring process right now. And I'm looking at a lot of resumes of folks that are older, right? And I'm thinking a lot about the value that they will bring, and thinking about the fact that many of them might be having some challenges finding roles. I don't know that for sure. I haven't talked to any of them about that specifically. But what would you say about leading older workers? For all of us as leaders, what do we need to know?
Well, I'm so glad that you're looking at those resumes. I am a big proponent of older workers. They have a lot to bring to the table. They have institutional memory. They tend to be reliable. Of course, they're experienced. I think older workers can be a real asset to any organization. The thing about older workers, though, I think two things, Kevin. Number one, they may not learn the same way as younger people. And so you have to understand that. They can learn, they can retrain, but it may not be exactly the same way as some 25-year-old. And the second thing is that younger workers have to learn how to manage older workers and vice versa. So I give the example of a woman who's a 35-year-old supervisor, and she's sitting across the table from a 65-year-old woman. And she says to herself, can I manage this woman? Can I train her? What's this going to be like? She looks like my mother.
Yeah.
And the woman on the other side of the table says, she's just a kid. Can I really report to a child? She looks like my daughter. And the thing that I hearken back to is 25 years ago, a lot of men used to stand around and say, can I report to a woman? Can I do that? And what do we see today? We see women running companies, running, military operations, running universities, running everything. And that question has been answered. And the same question about managing up and down with older workers is going to be answered the same way.
I love that. It's often there are men that didn't and couldn't and wouldn't answer that question. And there will be younger and older workers that can't and won't answer those questions. But that's an individual thing, not
right.
a societal thing. And you're answering the societal question, which I think is exactly right. And it challenges all of us. It encourages, I believe, and it inspires all of us. And so I appreciate that. So a couple of other things before we go, Bill, and many of my listeners will know, might be guessing what question's coming next. Bill, what do you do for fun?
Well, I'm sitting in my basement right now. And I have
so are a lot of other people.
Yeah.
You're not alone in that one, Bill.
Yeah, I've got a treadmill down here, an exercise cycle, a rowing machine, some free weights. So every day I try to get my workout in. And when the weather's good, I go outside, put on my mask, and take a long walk. But the second thing is, Kevin, even though we're separated and COVID is not an easy deal, I really try to keep close tabs with my family.
Perfect. Excellent. As I've been saying, the right phrase is physical distancing, not social.
Yes. Yes.
A misnomer that has had drastic implications for us. So the other thing, and the only question I told you I was going to ask is, so what are you reading these days, Bill?
Well, I just finished a book that I really found to be interesting. It was written by a guy named Haidt, Jonathan Haidt, and it's called The Righteous Mind. And Kevin, this book, he's a social scientist. This book helped me to think about the political toxicity that we have today. And one of the findings he claims is that human beings, intuition almost always trumps reason. And so we have to think to ourselves, how are we going to cross the aisle? How are we going to find ways to close the gaps between red and blue states, between Republicans and Democrats, between liberals and conservatives? And you're not going to basically agree on everything. What we have to do is, and I think he gives us some ideas here, what we have to do is find out what we can agree on. It could be climate change, it could be infrastructure, it could be a lot of different things. So that book helped me there. And the second one, Kevin, I'm reading right now is by Stephen Ambrose, the guy who wrote about Lewis and Clark. He's a great historian, a good writer. And he wrote this book probably 15 years ago. And it was like a summing up of all of his history books. And you read this book and he's almost, this is not a completely fair word, but he's almost a cheerleader for America. And it brings you and me back to what do we owe our grandchildren?
What's
And
the
what do you
title
think?
of the book?
I can't think of the name of it, but it's
We'll figure it out, everybody. And we'll get it in the
figure
show.
it out. We'll figure it out.
We'll
But
get it
what
in the
he's
show notes.
basically saying is, again, this is a great country.
One of the many things, Bill, that I believe you and I can agree on. Before we go, where do you want to point people? Where can people learn more about you and your work? Where can they get the book? What do you want to tell people about all of that?
BillNovelli.com. That's all you need to know. And I hope people will read the book because a lot of what you and I just talked about is in there.
Bill Novelli, everybody. Good Business, the talk, fight, win way to change the world. If you're watching there, you can see it again. Beautiful red cover. Bill, thanks for being here. It's been a pleasure. Before we go, and before I say goodbye to Bill, a question for all of you. Okay, maybe you found this interesting. Maybe you found it enjoyable. But the question is, now what? What are you going to do with this? What did you learn that you want to apply? What ideas do you take from this? Whether it's, hey, I need to look at some different resumes, or, hey, I need to think differently about that person who's 20 years older or 20 years younger than me across the table, or whatever it might be. Ideas that Bill gave you about being a leader and having the courage of conviction, or having the courage to move someone from the team if it's not working, whatever it might have been. The only thing that really matters here is that you take some action, and both of us hope that you'll do that, because that is how we can change the world. And as leaders, that's how we can change the world for the better. Bill, thank you so much for being here. It was totally a pleasure. I was looking forward to it. I'm so glad we had the chance to chat.
Thank you, Kevin.
Before we go, everybody, this episode was brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Teammate, Staying Engaged and Connected While Working Anywhere. You can go to longdistanceteammate.com to learn more, because there's a big difference between working from home and being a successful remote teammate. And with that, I'll leave you until next week, when I'll be back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, and we'll see you all